A black boy says his father is a scientist. The class laughs. The teacher looks away. And in that moment, something far heavier than silence teaches him. Your truth only matters if the world finds it convenient. They said the man in the hallway didn't belong. Too dark, too plain, too quiet to be anyone important. No badge, no briefcase. Just a worn folder tucked under one arm, and skin that carried too many stories this town never bothered to hear. They'd seen men like him before, on the night shift, pushing brooms or fixing pipes, but never walking toward a classroom like he had something to say. Inside, his son Tariq sat alone. 12 years old, straight-A student, invisible anyway. He had told them his father was a molecular biologist. They laughed, said, "Be real, kid," said, "People like you don't come from people like that." But this morning, the hallway was quiet. Too quiet. Because when that door opened, and the man they'd dismissed stepped through, what entered wasn't just a father. It was truth. And truth doesn't knock. It walks in, and it makes you look it in the eye. They noticed him the way people notice a flickering streetlight. Dim, almost forgettable, but not quite. The man standing in the school hallway wore no suit, no polished shoes, no ID lanyard swinging from his neck. His shirt was crisply pressed, but plain. His hands were calloused, not from construction, but from years of working with glass vials and stainless steel lab tools. Still, to the receptionist behind the desk, he looked like someone who'd taken a wrong turn. She smiled thinly, asked if he was a delivery man. He said calmly, "I'm here for the Science and Family Day. My son's in Mrs. Ellison's class." Her smile faltered for a second, just a breath, and then she gestured down the hall, pointing him toward a room already heavy with assumptions. In room 204, 12-year-old Tariq Okafor sat upright in his desk, spine straight as a ruler, fingers lightly touching a folder that held exactly what no one had believed. 2 nights ago, he told the class that his father was a cellular biologist. Not just a scientist, but a lead researcher in a Midwestern medical institute, with published work in oncology journals most people in the room had never heard of. The laughter hadn't come all at once. It had crept in, like fog, slow, whispered, laced with disbelief. Then louder. Then merciless. Tariq didn't cry. He'd learned not to. He just sat still, holding his folder, holding the truth, while his classmates snorted and smirked. One of them muttered, "Sure. And my dad's Barack Obama." Mrs. Ellison had tried to redirect, said something neutral like, "Let's remember to be respectful," but her voice held no defense, no belief. Her silence was an agreement they all understood. People like him don't come from people like that. That was the line, though no one had to say it aloud. It hung in the air, woven into the fabric of the room, like dust you learn to live with. And that's the thing about racism in the Midwest. It's rarely shouted anymore. It's handed down in raised eyebrows, in the way a name is repeated back to you like a question, in how quickly your truth is sized up, then filed away under unlikely. The first time it happened to Tariq, he was 6. He'd drawn a picture of his father at work, wearing goggles, surrounded by lab tubes. His teacher told him it was a very creative imagination. The next day, she praised another boy's drawing of his dad on a tractor, said it looked so real. Tariq learned early. Credibility has a face, and it doesn't look like his. Now, as the classroom filled with parents, some in khakis, others in suits, one in a World's Best Dad t-shirt, Tariq watched the door. His breath was steady, but his stomach coiled. He wasn't afraid of being wrong. He was afraid of being right, and still did not believe. That fear lives in many black children, whether they can name it or not. It's the quiet anxiety of knowing your excellence must arrive with a receipt. That truth, to be accepted, must dress up, shave, and smile, because your skin alone is not enough. The door opened. He stepped in. Obinna Okafor, originally from Enugu, Nigeria, didn't walk like he had something to prove. He walked like a man who had long stopped asking permission to exist. He wore no tie. His slacks were a little too short. His accent was soft, colored by years of moving between continents and institutions. But when he smiled, it was with the patience of someone who had lived in rooms that questioned his credentials and left with the awards anyway. Some parents blinked. Some adjusted in their seats. Mrs. Ellison's hand briefly hovered near her clipboard, unsure if she had misfiled his name. Obinna greeted her warmly. "I hope I'm not late," he said. "My son told me I had exactly 5 minutes to convince the world he wasn't lying." The room chuckled, some out of politeness, some out of discomfort. But what followed was not a speech. It was a small story about proteins, about mutation, about the way cells forget how to die and turn immortal. He used analogies. He made the kids laugh. He didn't try to impress. He just tried to be clear. And it was in that clarity that something shifted. The same kids who had laughed at Tariq 2 days earlier now leaned forward, eyes wide. Not because Obinna had raised his voice, or shown a plaque, or named his titles, but because the world had just tilted. Their expectations had quietly collapsed under the weight of proof. And here's the part no one said out loud. They hadn't doubted the science. They had doubted the skin. It wasn't just disbelief in what Tariq claimed. It was disbelief in who he could come from, in the kind of father who could raise a boy like that. That's what racism does best. It narrows the imagination. But truth has a way of outlasting assumptions, of walking into a room and not asking to be seen, just standing there, fully, and daring you to look closer. Tariq had always known how to make himself small, not invisible. He was too sharp for that, too curious, but small in the way that smart black boys learn early. Don't raise your hand too much. Don't correct the teacher. Don't win too easily or too often. He learned how to nod without agreement, how to smile without being too proud, how to shrink brilliance into politeness. In Mrs. Ellison's class, he was the only child of color. The desks were the same size, the books handed out evenly, but the space around him always felt tighter, like the air gave less room to breathe. He sat in the 3rd row, by the window, chosen, not by chance, but by instinct. That was the row where you could look outside when no one looked back at you. The window gave escape, and for kids like him, escape wasn't a fantasy. It was survival. The announcement came on a Tuesday. Next week, Family and Science Day. Each student would present on what their parent or guardian did for work. The idea was simple: inspire curiosity, share knowledge, bring families into learning. But ideas, like people, are rarely neutral. Some kids cheered. "My mom's a nurse," one said. "My dad builds engines," another added. Their voices rose with excitement, already picturing the applause. Tariq hesitated. He knew what his father did. He knew how many people didn't believe it. He knew how quickly a fact, spoken by someone who looked like him, could turn into a fairy tale in their eyes. When his turn came to speak, he kept it simple. "My father is a molecular biologist," he said. "He studies cancer cells. He teaches, and he researches cures." Silence. Then a single laugh. Quick, sharp, and unchecked. Then another, and another. It wasn't the loud kind of ridicule. It was the slow kind. The cruel kind that comes not from disbelief, but from a certainty masked as common sense. Mrs. Ellison tried to smile. "That's impressive, Tariq," she said, voice light, forced. "Very creative. Are you sure that's what he does?" He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." She didn't ask for details. She didn't write it down. And in that moment, Tariq felt something shift. Not in them, but in him. It wasn't new. It was old, worn like a hand-me-down jacket he'd never asked for. That soft, aching weight of not being believed. Not because he sounded unsure, but because he sounded too certain. The following day, Mrs. Ellison handed out the presentation schedule. Tariq checked twice. His name wasn't there. When he raised his hand to ask, she walked over and spoke softly, as if her tone could make the erasure gentler. I thought maybe your father might be busy. These events can be a bit overwhelming. He stared at her. Not angry, not confused, just still. Because that's how doubt works. It doesn't scream in your face. It pats your shoulder and changes the subject. It smiles when it silences you, and when it removes you from the list, it makes it sound like it's doing you a favor. At home that evening, Obinna read the paper twice, then a third time. He didn't comment on his name being missing. He just folded the schedule neatly and set it beside his research notes. Do you still want me to come? He asked Tariq. Tariq nodded once. I'm not going to wear a tie, Obinna said. You don't have to, Tariq replied. Just tell them what you know. Obinna chuckled. That might take longer than 5 minutes. Tariq didn't smile. Then take 6. The air between them was quiet, but not empty. It held the unsaid truths passed down from father to son. Truths about how knowledge in a black mouth often sounds like arrogance, how excellence without apology feels like a threat, how sometimes even your truth needs a costume to be allowed through the door. Obinna had never worn one. The truth, he believed, was sharp enough on its own. And that's what scared people. It wasn't that they didn't understand what he did. It's that they couldn't reconcile it with how he looked doing it. In their eyes, brilliance was supposed to come in different packaging: pale skin, polished shoes, maybe an accent from Oxford. Not Enugu. Tariq walked into class the next morning with his folder tucked close to his chest. Inside was a copy of an article co-authored by his father in Nature Oncology. Peer-reviewed. Published. Real. But reality, he knew, didn't always survive perception. Not when perception had been rehearsed for generations. He sat in the third row again, this time not by instinct, but by choice. The light from the window spilled across his desk like a quiet witness. He waited. He didn't fidget. He didn't flinch. He had brought the truth. He was ready to watch the room decide whether it deserved to hear it. At exactly 9:02 a.m., the classroom door creaked open. Mrs. Ellison, halfway through arranging a stack of visual aids on the projector table, looked up, startled. Not rudely, just mechanically. She wasn't expecting him. She wasn't ready. Obinna Okafor stepped into the room, not like a guest, but like a man who knew the ground he walked on had been paved, in part, by silence. He wore a plain, open-collared shirt, dark slacks, and a pair of well-worn leather shoes. No briefcase, no slick PowerPoint, just a clear folder tucked under one arm, and the kind of composure that made noise irrelevant. For a second, no one moved. Then Mrs. Ellison blinked and offered a thin smile. Mr. Okafor? She asked, her voice lifting at the end like a question she didn't want answered too loudly. Yes, he said simply. She looked down at her clipboard, eyes searching for a name that should have been there but wasn't. We hadn't received confirmation you'd be attending today. I understand, he said. But my son asked me to come. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. The silence in the room had shifted, not awkward, not hostile, just heavier. Tariq sat frozen in the third row, watching his father with wide, unblinking eyes. For a second, he looked smaller than he had in days, like the weight of the moment had pulled his shoulders inward. But then, Obinna glanced at him, and the boy straightened just slightly. It was enough. Mrs. Ellison gestured stiffly toward the front of the room. Well, we still have a few minutes left. Feel free to, share a little something. Obinna walked to the front without haste. He set the folder down, opened it, and took out a single laminated printout. A diagram of a mutated cell, color-coded in shades of green and red. Then he looked at the class. He didn't start with credentials. He didn't start with anecdotes. He started with a question. Have you ever wondered why some cells forget how to die? A few students stirred, heads tilted. Someone at the back dropped a pencil. In biology, he continued, we call this process apoptosis. It's how the body keeps balance. But cancer cells, they don't follow that rule. They mutate. They live longer than they should. They ignore the signals. And they grow. His voice wasn't booming. It didn't need to be. It was steady, patient, deliberate, like a stone skipping across still water, each word rippling farther than it seemed. He picked up a small tennis ball from his folder and held it aloft. Imagine this is a healthy cell. Now imagine, if, instead of doing its job, it starts duplicating itself, not because the body needs it, but because it refuses to listen. He tossed the ball gently, caught it, then set it down. And sometimes, people are like that too, he added. They ignore what's true, what's balanced, because somewhere along the way, they've learned not to believe certain things, especially when those things come in the wrong color. The room froze. Mrs. Ellison flinched, just barely. A student in the second row shifted in their seat. Obinna didn't flinch. I've studied cells for over 20 years. I've published papers in journals I don't expect you to read. I've taught in rooms larger than this one and smaller. But today, I'm here for 5 minutes, because my son stood in this room and told the truth. And you laughed. His eyes moved across the students, pausing not to accuse but to reflect. You didn't laugh because the science was wrong. You laughed because you couldn't picture someone like me being the father of someone like him. That's not science. That's conditioning. Tariq looked down at his desk. Not to hide, to breathe. Obinna continued, I don't need you to clap. I don't need you to believe in me. But I need you to understand what it means when a child tells the truth, and is called a liar not because of his words but because of your assumptions. There was no applause, but there was stillness. And stillness, in a room that had once been full of smirks and whispers, was its own kind of justice. Obinna turned to his son. Tariq, he said, you carry more than my name. You carry my work, my fight, and my hope. And you did not lie. Then he turned back to the class. Sometimes, truth doesn't wear a lab coat. Sometimes, it wears skin that makes people uncomfortable. But it's still true. And truth doesn't need permission to be real. He packed up his folder, nodded once to Mrs. Ellison, and walked out the door without waiting for anything more. Tariq watched him leave. His chest was tight, but for the first time in days, he didn't feel like shrinking. He didn't feel like fading. He felt seen. And for a boy who had learned to make himself small, that was the biggest thing of all. The Monday after Family and Science Day arrived with the usual chill of early spring. The school bus hissed to a stop, its doors creaking open like always. But when Tariq stepped on, something was different. No one moved out of his way, but no one leaned back to whisper either. The seat next to Colin, the same kid who had laughed loudest, remained empty, until a boy Tariq barely knew scooted over and tapped the seat beside him. It wasn't an apology, but it was something. At school, the hallways hummed with the usual energy, sneakers squeaking, lockers slamming. But the stares were fewer, or maybe softer, like eyes had learned how to look without burning. In room 204, Mrs. Ellison stood at her desk, organizing papers with her usual efficiency. She didn't look up when Tariq entered, but she didn't avoid his gaze either. That was new. She called roll, her voice steady. Then she paused and, almost as an afterthought, added, "Thank you to those who participated last Friday. We appreciate every story shared." Her eyes flicked briefly in Tariq's direction, then moved on. It wasn't much. But in a classroom where silence had once been a form of exclusion, even acknowledgement felt like revolution. During science class, something strange happened. Tariq had always been quick to understand new concepts, but he rarely spoke up. Not because he didn't know the answers, he almost always did, but because being right too often made him a target. But when Mrs. Ellison asked a question about cellular division, he raised his hand. She hesitated for half a second, then nodded. "Yes, Tariq?" He answered, calmly, clearly. "Correct," she said, this time without surprise, without delay. That afternoon, as the students packed up, Colin walked by Tariq's desk and mumbled something that could have been, "Cool Dad." Or maybe it was, "You were right." He didn't stop to explain, and Tariq didn't ask. The change wasn't loud. It didn't come with applause or banners or official letters of apology. It came in pauses, in lowered voices, in small shifts in tone. But change was there, even in Mrs. Ellison. A few days later, she asked Tariq if he would help her lead a group activity on genetics. Not as a favor, not as a show, but because, she said, "You understand this better than most." He agreed, not because he needed her approval, but because he had finally stopped hiding what he knew. That night at dinner, Tariq told his father about it. Obinna listened, quietly stirring his tea. Then he said, "That's how it starts, not with headlines. With hands raised." Tariq nodded. He understood now. He didn't want fame. He didn't want revenge. What he wanted was simpler, older, to be believed, to be allowed to exist at full volume, without having to soften who he was to fit someone else's comfort. In the cafeteria, where he used to eat alone, a few kids started nodding at him. One even asked about the tennis ball his dad had used. Tariq explained briefly. The kid said, "That was cool," and went back to his sandwich. It was ordinary, and that, in itself, was extraordinary. Mrs. Ellison began a new classroom project later that week. It was called Unwritten Histories, and students were invited to write short stories or essays about their families, real or imagined, that challenged assumptions. She said it was inspired by recent events, but she didn't name Tariq. She didn't have to. Everyone understood. Tariq wrote about his father's journey from Nigeria to the United States, about the years of quiet sacrifice, the late nights in labs, the lectures delivered with a thick accent and razor-sharp clarity. He titled it, "The Loudest Silence." Mrs. Ellison read it aloud to the class. No one laughed. Later, she asked if he'd consider submitting it to the district writing contest. He said yes, but even if he hadn't, it wouldn't have mattered. The most important part had already happened. He had been heard. Not perfectly, not without resistance, but truly. And maybe that's how change works. Not with grand gestures, but with subtle corrections. With teachers who stop assuming. With students who stop laughing. With boys who stop shrinking. That weekend, Tariq went with his father to the university lab. Obinna showed him around. The microscopes, the journals, the notes scribbled in the margins of research papers. Tariq looked at it all, not with the eyes of a child trying to prove something, but as a son claiming what had always been his. On the way home, Obinna said, "You did more in 5 minutes than most adults do in 5 years." Tariq smiled. "I didn't even finish my folder." "You didn't need to," Obinna said. "You brought yourself." And for the first time, that had been enough. On the last day of the semester, the sun came up early and strong. The sky was clean, blue, endless. Tariq walked to school without looking down once. He used to count sidewalk cracks, watch his feet move, half out of habit, half out of caution. But not today. In room 204, the desks had been rearranged in a loose circle. The posters on the wall had changed. There were new faces drawn in marker, stories typed and taped to the bulletin board, part of the Unwritten Histories project. Tariq was up there too. His father had smiled when he saw it, quietly nodding, as if recognizing a piece of himself in the boy's words. Mrs. Ellison called on students to share final reflections. Some read stories. Some mumbled thanks. Colin, who hadn't spoken to Tariq in more than a few words since September, stood and read a short poem about his grandfather's hands. It wasn't polished, but it was honest. When it was Tariq's turn, he didn't read. He spoke. "I used to think being smart meant being quiet," he said, voice even, eyes forward. "That if I kept my head down, people would leave me alone. That blending in was the best I could hope for." He paused. No one looked away. "But it turns out, hiding who you are just makes you feel smaller, and the world won't grow to fit you. You have to take up space on purpose." There were no cheers, just silence, a better kind, the kind that listens. After class, Mrs. Ellison approached him. "You've taught me a lot this year," she said. Tariq didn't say, "I know." He didn't need to. Growth speaks without volume. That afternoon, he walked home with his backpack slung low and light. His science folder was tucked inside, not because he needed proof anymore, but because it had become a part of him, like muscle memory, like armor that didn't weigh him down anymore. At home, the house smelled of rice and grilled fish. His father was at the table, surrounded by open books, scribbled notes, and an unfinished crossword. "How was it?" Obinna asked. "Quiet," Tariq said. Obinna smiled. "That's good. Sometimes the world changes when it finally shuts up long enough to hear." Tariq laughed, soft and real. They ate dinner without hurry. No screens, no rush, just the clink of forks and the soft hum of the old radio in the corner. Later, in his room, Tariq opened his journal and wrote one final entry for the school year. He didn't write about the laughter or the silence, or even the day his father spoke to the class. He wrote about a moment no one saw, when he looked in the mirror that morning and for the first time didn't brace himself. He just looked and saw someone he didn't want to hide. He ended the entry with a single line: "I'm not proof, I'm the beginning." And that was it. Because sometimes the bravest thing a child can do is believe himself before the world permits him. Outside, the sky was still wide. The stars were coming into view, one by one. Obinna tapped on the door, just once. "Can I come in?" Tariq nodded. They sat side by side on the bed. No speeches, no lessons, just father and son, quiet in the same space. "You know," Obinna said finally, "when I was your age, I didn't even know what a scientist looked like." Tariq smiled. "Me neither. But now," his father added, "I know what truth looks like, and it looks a lot like you." Tariq didn't answer. He didn't have to, because this time, silence wasn't empty. It was full. The next day, they went for a walk through the neighborhood. Nothing special, just sneakers on sidewalks, wind in the trees, the sound of distant lawnmowers, humming like memory. A few neighbors waved. One older man nodded toward Obinna and said, "That was quite the lesson you gave. My daughter came home talking about it." Obinna didn't boast. He just said, "I'm glad she listened." Tariq watched the exchange and felt something shift again. It wasn't big, but it was real. The way a door creaks open slightly more than it did the day before. The way sunlight inches across the floor. Later, as they turned down their street, Obinna said, "You know, what you did, it'll ripple." Tariq looked up. "People may not say it. They may never thank you. But change doesn't need to be loud to be real." Tariq nodded. "I think I get it now." Obinna smiled. "Then I think we're ready for summer." What if the bravest thing a child ever does isn't standing up to a bully or winning a trophy, but simply telling the truth and daring to believe someone will listen? Tariq's story is not just about school or science or skin. It's about memory, about how deeply we've been taught to trust certain voices and quietly question others. And if you grew up in a world where your own father's worth was measured by the color of his hands or his accent, you know how heavy that truth can be. But truth doesn't wear a suit. It doesn't ask permission. It arrives, sometimes softly, in the voice of a child, and waits for someone to believe. So if this story reminded you of something, your father, your teacher, a moment you stayed silent when you should have spoken, tell us. Right here, in the comments. Your words matter. They always have. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that speak to where we've been and where we can still go. And if you have someone in your life who needs to hear this, don't wait. Share it. Thank you for watching our story. We're honored you stayed. See you in the next video.